Welcome to the Think Christian podcast, where we're going to mark Holy Week with a bunch of movies, because there's no such thing as secular. Hi there, I'm Josh Larson, your host and editor over at Think Christian. We all probably mark Holy Week in different ways because we have different liturgical practices that we follow, depending on our church background. In addition to those good traditions, we thought we would throw a couple of movies into the mix. Abby Olcese has been writing a series for us over at thinkchristian.net over the last couple of years, pairing certain films with important days on the liturgical calendar, including Good Friday and Easter. Those have been well received, so we thought it would be fruitful to talk about a couple of her picks here on the show. We're going to list all of the titles, so you'll come away with 10 recommendations, and then we're going to discuss two of them in depth. Abby will be on to talk about one of them, and then I'll also be joined by J.R. Forasteros. First, though, a sincere thanks to those of you who have recently left reviews of the podcast on Apple Podcasts. We've gotten some generous ones in, and yes, they make us feel good, but they also help to keep us on the radar of Apple Podcasts so that people can find us on the platform. Now, one review that warmed our hearts particularly came from Jacob Allen. I'd recommend the show to anyone, whether you're a person of faith or not. I need the reminder that there is room in the kingdom of God for nuance, creativity, and people of all sorts of backgrounds and identities. And each episode of this show gives testimony to that. Thank you so much, Jacob, for leaving that review. We really appreciate it. If other listeners want to go ahead and leave a review as well, it's actually easy to do while you're listening. If you're in the Apple Podcasts app, just scroll down to click on the show link, then scroll down again until you get to reviews, and that's where you can leave one. Thank you very much. With that, let's jump into our list of films for Holy Week, starting with Abby Olcese and a handful of pictures that are evocative of Good Friday. I'm glad that Abby Olcese has wrapped up her film festival coverage and has time to spend with us here on the TC podcast. Both True False and South by Southwest, they're done, right, Abby? You're finished with those?
Yes. Yeah. It was a whirlwind week. I think I was home for a total of 3 days over 2 weeks between the two of those festivals.
And hopefully good stuff the rest of us should keep an eye out for coming down the rest of the year for the movies?
Yeah, I'd say so, definitely. There were a number of really good films at True False. I think one of the probably bigger, higher profile ones that also premiered at South by Southwest is the documentary Fire of Love. It's about...
is this the volcano one?
Yes. Yeah. I feel like it's always a really hard sell when I tell people it's about married volcanologists. But yeah, it's about a pair of volcanologists who were active in the 60s up until the early 90s. And they were married to each other. They made a lot of really great films and took a lot of really good footage of active volcanoes and helped us learn about how volcanoes work. And they were also super cute. So it's really fun to watch them being adorable together, and also the fruits of their labor, which is just visually stunning.
I've heard others highlight that one, and I've seen some of the images, online that have been posted from some of that footage.
Yeah.
So yeah, you've got me. I'm hooked. I'm looking forward to that one for sure.
Yeah, it's really unique, I think.
Good. I'll keep my eye out for it. So to the business at hand, we wanted to kind of build a show around this series of posts that you've been writing for us at Think Christian over on the website, Abby, for the last couple of years now at thinkchristian.net, pairing films with certain days on the church calendar. The first one you did for this actually was for Good Friday. This was back in 2020. So, we've talked about this together as you kind of envisioned how to do this, but I think maybe listeners might be curious to learn a little bit about your process behind this sort of writing, because it is unique. It's an interesting way to approach both film and I think the church calendar. So I'm wondering if do you start with the movies, basically, that are spiritually significant for you and then try to place them on the calendar? Or do you look at the holy days and then see what films come to mind? Maybe it's something totally different, a mixture of both, but give us a little peek into how you approach an assignment like this.
Yeah, it was, I think, well, it still is a challenge in interesting ways at different times, depending on what I am writing about. I know I think the last article that I did for this was Pentecost, and that one took a little bit. And that was actually a fun exercise in kind of discerning what the themes of Pentecost really are.
Yeah.
But that's usually where I like to start from, is to look at the part of the liturgical calendar that I am considering and what the dominant themes of that are, and then trying to match that to what I know exists in movies that I love and also movies that other people love. In some cases, this has been kind of a group effort in that I will pull other TC writers and other friends who have different experiences than I do and say,
Mm.
listen, do you have any movies that you think are really good for this particular time of the liturgical year? A conversation I had with J.R. Forasteros is why Fast and Furious 6 is on the Pentecost list at all. I had an epiphany at some point and I ran it past him and I was like, hey, you like these movies. Does this work? And he was like, absolutely.
Nice.
So it's always fun when that works
I like
out.
that.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it's nice, perfect fitting that JR is going to be on this episode as well. So that fits. And that's smart too, because I think when it comes to these sorts of holidays, we do all come from slightly different backgrounds, or sometimes drastically different backgrounds in how we have marked them in our church lives in the past, the traditions we followed, what these days mean to us. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense to kind of do a little polling here and see what things you might want to consider or cover. Let's go back to Good Friday. As I said, the first post that you tackled for this series, and you put 5 movies on your list. So for most of these, it's a list of 5. And some of them here do have explicitly religious settings. Some don't. Some are further afield, like Fast and Furious. But I'm going to list these here so people have a sense of your entire list. You mentioned The Last Temptation of Christ. So Martin Scorsese's controversial 1988 movie about Jesus' final days. Climaxes at Calvary, very fitting. The Mission was another pick of yours. This is a historical drama about Jesuit missionaries in 18th century South America. That one stars Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons. A Hidden Life was also on the list, Terrence Malick's most recent film about World War II Austrian martyr Franz Jägerstätter. And then you included 2 big franchise installments, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, and Rogue One, a Star Wars story. So I encourage folks to go to thinkchristian.net to read your thoughts on each one of those. We'll also link to that article in the show notes, so it's easy to find. But Abby, we're going to focus on Rogue One. Maybe before we talk about it in Good Friday terms, though, there have been a lot of Star Wars content since Rogue One. So maybe you should remind listeners what part of the Star Wars story Rogue One tells. And I'm just going to say, we can go ahead and discuss spoilers because it has been out for a while. And I think in the context of this conversation, we're absolutely going to have to. So catch us up a little bit on Rogue One, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So Rogue One in the Star Wars canon overall takes place just before A New Hope. It is the story of the group of rebels who are responsible for stealing the Death Star plans and transmitting them to Princess Leia. So basically, it takes us right up until the opening moments of A New Hope. It does a little bit of the thing that critics don't love in movies, which is that it answers questions that nobody really wanted answered, which is, why does the Death Star have that weird, obvious flaw? It turns out that's intentional. But it's the real strength of the movie isn't necessarily the way that it answers kind of pedantic questions like that, but the way that it looks at the dynamic of the group of people who are responsible for getting those plans stolen and the kind of tenuous relationship they have to each other and to the concept of hope and to the concept of the rebellion.
And how did you receive it when it first came out? Because I was, I think I gave it a middling review, was kind of conflicted. I've come around to it this time on a rewatch a little bit more, I think mostly because I've come to accept this expanded Star Wars universe that we're now living in, MCU style, and some of the things you mentioned where they are giving fan service elements. I mean, that is just kind of what we're living in now, the cyclical nature of returning to this story in some of these locations. Maybe after something like The Mandalorian, which I appreciated, Book of Boba Fett, maybe a little bit less, but those haven't reignited my interest in these side glances at the franchise. So I think I was just more open to that this time. But how about you? Were you a fan right at the start, I'm assuming? You liked it a little bit more than I did when it first came out?
I was. I think I liked this movie a lot more than a lot of people did when it first came out. I was already drawn to the way that Gareth Edwards has just this really interesting focus on details. I think you see it like right in the opening scene. I think that was what really grabbed me the first time I watched it, was like when you see the main character, Jyn Erso, as a child being removed from her family, and you see the death of her mother and her father, who's the designer of the Death Star weapon, being kind of taken back into the fold. And right before that, when she first bursts into the house, like there's an abandoned tray of like blue milk and glasses. And then later on, when Jyn is on the run and some stormtroopers are looking for her, they find like a little wooden stormtrooper toy. Like these are things that we've never actually seen in the larger Star Wars universe. We've heard references to them maybe, but we've never actually seen like what would it look like to be a normal person functioning in this society. And I think it's really, from a perspective of looking at war and emotional trauma related to that and what it looks like to have your life disrupted that suddenly. I feel like this was a movie in the series that already kind of did that a little bit better and a little bit more directly than a lot of the other films had done to that point.
No, that makes sense. And the director, Gareth Edwards, you mentioned that attention to detail. I remember appreciating also that opening you called out. And I think that's what I have come to like, especially about The Mandalorian, is we are getting immersed in these sort of like daily ideas of what it would be like to live in this time and in this place. And I agree that's a strength of the movie. The other thing that I did like when I first saw it was the ending. I really appreciated the sort of boldness of the ending, even at the time. And for me, I think that's where the Good Friday significance can really be felt in how Rogue One comes to a conclusion. So is it the same for you? Are there other elements of the film that play a part into this Good Friday idea as well? Or is it mostly embedded in that ending for you?
I think part of it is embedded in the ending, but it's a sense that kind of runs throughout the film. Like when this was first announced and you saw initial pictures of like the cast and some thoughts about what the story was gonna be like, anybody who was sort of familiar with the Star Wars universe up to that point was just like, how is this going to go? There's a good chance that it's not going to end well for any of these characters just by design.
Mm-hmm.
These are not names that we've heard in the larger Star Wars universe. We know kind of the danger inherent in that. We know what state the rebellion is in at the beginning of A New Hope. We know that it's quite likely that these characters will die. And then to have that not even avoided, but just like, brought head on, I thought was, a very bold choice. And I think could be a reason that some people weren't as receptive to the film when it first came out. I totally get that, especially given that it came out in 2016, which was a pretty grim year for a lot of reasons. It just felt like kind of a downer in a series of downers. Mm-hmm. But I've really come to embrace the way that ends and the way that it kind of addresses the importance of that sacrifice throughout for the entire course of the story. When you think about it, and it really doesn't take a lot of thinking to realize this, like without this sacrifice, the Star Wars that we know does not exist, which I think has a really strong parallel to the gospel narrative, right? Like without the sacrifice of Christ, Christianity as we know it doesn't really exist. That's kind of the lodestone, right? So I think to have something that includes that same sense of emotional importance with regard to people kind of standing up, doing the right thing, knowing that they are working for something that is larger than them, that's going to have larger implications for a huge number of people, I think is really thematically appropriate for Good Friday and something that's really striking for this movie specifically, because I feel like that doesn't necessarily exist in a lot of the other Star Wars films.
Yeah, and I think Edwards depicts that brilliantly in the visuals too, with how this movie ends, or at least before we get that little bit of an epilogue, which takes us further into A New Hope. But at least where Rogue One proper ends, it is of Jyn, played by Felicity Jones. And I believe the character's name is Cassian, played by Diego Luna. Mm-hmm. They are sort of the last two standing of this mission, and they are on this planet that is essentially been doomed by the Death Star. There's nothing they can do about it. Their mission has succeeded, but because they have been willing to sacrifice themselves is how it's presented in the narrative. And the two of them kind of holding each other on this beach, just awaiting, not happily awaiting, but accepting what is going to be required of them, I think is a really powerful image. When we talk about, parallels to Good Friday and Christ's sacrifice, I think sometimes one of the things that movie depictions miss out, they're very good on depicting the sacrifice, because that is often an action that can be depicted on screen. But I wonder if the idea of atonement gets lost a little bit, which of course is crucial to a Christian understanding of what happened on Good Friday. And so I was thinking about that in terms of Rogue One and the various sacrifices being made here. Throw something at you, see if it sticks for you, Abby, and maybe you have another idea of thinking about atonement in terms of this movie. But you mentioned Jin's father, played by Mads Mikkelsen, how the movie begins with him. He is this, at that point, a rogue scientist who has left the Galactic Empire because he did not want to build the Death Star. For various complications, he gets pulled back in and is reluctantly doing that, yet still has, despite those reservations, built this weapon, this terrible, terrible weapon. And I wonder if we see Jin's sacrifice, again, she's in that final scene, being in some way an act of atonement for her father. It's enabled by her father. That's the weakness built into it you referenced earlier. You know, he did that. He took action to see that this might happen as well. But I'm wondering if maybe her act is also something of an act of an atonement, or if there's other forms of atonement you see in the movie. I don't know if that makes any sense for you.
Yeah, definitely. I think the concept of atonement is huge throughout the film. And I think Jin's journey is part of that. You see all of these characters kind of jaded and compromised when we meet them. Cassian's introduction as well is one that we don't typically get for what we would consider a heroic character in a Star Wars film, in that he is on a planet with a fellow rebel spy and he has to get out, and the other guy has a wounded arm and he's not going to be able to get out as fast. So he just kills him, straight up kills him with a blaster.
Yeah, I had forgotten that.
Yeah. And that's a really dark introduction. That's, I mean, I would say that's even darker than whatever you feel about Han shot first. Like, that is, he sacrificed somebody to do that. And, and he knows it too. And he feels bad about it.
Right.
And we kind of get flashes of that throughout, that he is, I think, at heart, a good person, that he really believes in the cause of the rebellion, that he has been in this fight, as he mentioned, since he was a child.
Everything I did for the rebellion. And every time I walked away from something I wanted to forget, I told myself it was for a cause that I believed in. A cause that was worth it. Without that, we're lost. Everything we've done would have been for nothing. I couldn't face myself if I gave up now.
But that's caused a lot of ethical boundaries to crumble for him by necessity. And he's at the point now where he's not really sure what's worth fighting for and what's possible. The concept of hope comes up several times, and the statement "rebellions are built on hope" comes up twice. I think when Cassian first mentions it to Jin, it's sort of snide. It's kind of a sarcastic, rebellions are built on hope. When Jin mentions it later in the film, it's a triumphant, like, we need to do this, rebellions are built on hope. And then the final mention that we get from Leia is that she has been given the gift of hope. And that is, I think, when it rings the most true. So we go from this kind of cynical, we sort of believe it, but do we really, to, if we really believe it, we have to act, to, we have it, we believe it, it's going to happen. Which I think also is kind of reflective of the journey of Good Friday, right? The way that the disciples are kind of disillusioned, scared, unsure when Jesus is first arrested, when they are brought even in some cases to the point of denial for their own sake, when he is crucified, and then upon his return and after their mourning, greeted with the gift of hope and the gift of truth. And yes, this was what was always going to happen, and this thing that we fought for but wasn't sure was going to happen actually did. There's a lot of atonement that goes on in the film, and there's a lot of atonement with uncertainty that comes with it, which I feel like is very appropriate to Good Friday, where you have something that you believe is worth fighting for, but like the way that we feel at the end of Good Friday, the film ends with an uncertainty for the characters who are directly involved as to whether or not what they did actually worked. We know it worked, but they don't.
Sure.
And I feel like that's a huge part of the effectiveness.
Yeah, that's true. And I like making that connection with Cassian's sort of journey throughout the film, because I like that it is Jin and Cassian who are the two characters left there that we're left with. So that's very fitting. Was there anything else, on this revisit you wanted to mention about Rogue One, or do you think we pretty much covered it?
We haven't really talked much about K2, who's one of my favorite characters.
He's so great, yes.
Yeah, the Imperial droid who is reprogrammed to work for the rebellion, basically, voiced by Alan Tudyk, I think. And I think that's a really interesting arc, too, in terms of redemption, in that by his very identity, he has to kind of work against his programming and constantly prove to people, and constantly prove to Jin specifically, that he is good and that he is working for good. And their relationship, I think, is a really interesting one in those terms. I think right before K2 sacrifices himself, which to me is like the first really emotional death in the film. Like Galen's death, spoilers, is sad, but kind of inevitable. K2's is a real
I
bummer,
would agree,
I think.
Yeah.
Because that's sort of when things start to get real for like the main characters that we're super invested in. But right before he kind of sacrifices himself, he speaks with Jin, and he says that her behavior is I think, consistently unpredictable or surprising. And for a strategic droid, which is what he is, I feel like that's pretty huge, that he's gone from, like, she is completely, I think, redeemed herself in his eyes. I think he has also redeemed himself in her eyes. And that's like a real, I think, moment of connection, which makes his death all the sadder, really, because like they just connected and they were just becoming friends.
Yeah.
But that's a moment I love as well.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that character, because that was another part that really worked for me upon initial viewing. And it is remarkable when you look at, these Star Wars films overall, that this concept of a droid, how many unique personalities are given, where they are as fully envisioned as any of the human or the more humanoid alien characters. We really do find ourselves attached to these droids, including here in Rogue One. Thank you so much, Abby. Again, we're going to let listeners check out your post to read about those other Good Friday films you chose. We'll maybe list them on the show page for this episode, and then, of course, link to the full post if they want to read more. But thank you for taking the lead on this series. It's one I've enjoyed editing. I always love seeing what titles are going to come back at me when you do this.
Yeah.
So that's been enjoyable. And yeah, thanks for coming on the show to discuss it with me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Josh. This was really fun.
Hey everyone, your musical liturgist, John J. Thompson here, and if you were listening on a platform other than YouTube, you would have just heard a little bit of Where Do We Go by Solange, a song that reminds me of the confusion and dismay the disciples may have been feeling when their Lord was executed. I sure hope you enjoy the 80 songs I have chosen and arranged to mark each day of Holy Week. If you grew up in a liturgical church, you're probably familiar with the commemoration of each day from Palm Sunday to Easter, but many of my less liturgical friends might not be familiar with the significance of each of the days of this most important week in the Christian calendar. From the triumphal entry of Jesus, to Jesus cursing a fig tree, cleansing a temple, and having his authority questioned, we consider Jesus predicting his own death, Judas betraying Jesus, and Jesus being anointed by Mary. There's the washing of feet at the Last Supper, the crucifixion on Good Friday, the time Jesus spent in the grave, and, of course, Easter Sunday. Yep, there are songs for each of these days. You can find the mix on the main Think Christian profile on Spotify, or just by clicking the links in the most recent email you've gotten from us. And I hope you enjoy the rock, folk, rap, alternative, indie, and other songs I have gathered for you. And here's hoping that you have a thoughtful, engaged, and meaningful Holy Week. Peace.
It's Josh Larson back with the TC Podcast, looking ahead to Easter with J.R. Forasteros. It always feels a bit strange to talk about Easter before we've experienced Good Friday, JR, but you're a pastor. You're used to planning the church calendar well in advance of the actual day, kind of being in two headspaces at once, right?
That's right. I'm actually working on my Easter sermon this week. So, I feel that weird tension of, wait, we're still in Lent, but yes. So
there you go. All right. Perfect, because we want to riff on Abby Olchessy's post, fourthinkchristian.net, 5 films for Easter. And it's a good list, but I do have a clear favorite that we're going to spend some time on. But briefly here, before we do that, I want to mention those other titles that she includes in her roundup. So she talks about The Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Clear Easter resonance there, right? And then she has a couple of more surprising picks, I think. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, a 1988 fantasy film from Terry Gilliam. Midnight Special, which is a good but very small-scale sci-fi drama. And then the Lego Movie 2, the second part. Now, listeners are going to have to go to the website to find out why Abby thinks the Lego Movie 2 is an Easter experience, JR, because you and I, we're going to dig into her 5th pick. And that is the 1999 animated film, The Iron Giant. Is that all right, or did you want to
Oh no,
just go
I'm
sideways
here for it.
into
Yeah.
Lego Movie?
That's right. I'll always talk about the Lego Movie, but no, we should definitely talk about the Iron Giant. There's plenty to talk about there.
Sounds good. Iron Giant, a film that, some people loved right away, got good reviews, but flopped at the box office for whatever reason in 99. Since then, it has really grown in stature, including as one of the last great films to employ traditional animation style. There is some computer animation going on there too, but if you look at it, it really feels like that almost hand-drawn style. And the more we get away from that, I think the Iron Giant to me stands out as one of those last gasps in an unfortunate, almost lost art form. There's some you'll see of it here and there now, but not as much as you used to. So, JR, tell us, maybe tell folks who aren't familiar with the Iron Giant, kind of the basic plot here, but then I'd also like to hear how you discovered it, what your history with it has been.
Sure. So the Iron Giant is sort of Iron Man before Iron Man was cool, right? He's a big space robot that crashes to Earth in the early in the Cold War. It's actually right after the Russians have launched Sputnik into space, and so there's this meteor impact, and a young boy finds this giant robot and he befriends it. We learn the robot's memory has been wiped, and over the course of the film, the robot slowly gains its memories back, and we learn that it was created by aliens to be a sort of a line of defense, like basically a drone soldier. And so it's a weapon, right? That's what it's there for. And the boy, in the meantime, compares the Iron Giant to Superman, says that he really thinks that the giant is heroic. And so that's sort of the tension at the heart of the film is the giant a weapon, or can he be a hero? And so, of course, the U.S. military gets involved because this is Cold War, and it all culminates with this big showdown where the giant thinks that the boy is dead. Of course he's not, because this is an animated movie, right? And the giant kind of gives in to his nature and almost goes to war with the U.S. Army, pulls back at the last minute, and then it's too late. The Army has already launched a nuclear missile. Again, it's a little more complicated than that, but the nuclear missile gets launched. And so after a heartfelt goodbye, gave me kind of T2 vibes, I know now why you cry, but it is something I can never do. Flies up, intercepts the missile, is exploded. Everyone thinks the Iron Giant is dead, but of course in the final scene of the film, we get just the tease of resurrection. So we have the Iron Giant sacrificing himself, giving up his own life in truly heroic fashion for not only the boy, but also for the U.S. military and the whole town. Rockwell, I believe is the town's name.
Sounds right.
Dying for everyone, even those who are attacking him. And then we get, again, just the tease of resurrection at the end, the promise that the giant is coming back to life. So
yeah,
that's a very small nutshell of a movie that has a lot of fun layers. This is one of those, okay, so it came out the year that I graduated from high school. This was the year, we just got a book that was all about how 1999 was somehow just this incredible year for film.
Yeah, amazing year, absolutely.
And so I honestly, it dropped through the cracks for me. I don't remember seeing a trailer for this movie. I don't remember seeing it at theaters, and I went to the theater a lot in 1999. It's one of those movies that I became aware of because people kept talking about it,
Yeah.
And honestly, my wife and I did not see it for the first time until last year. We finally decided we needed to sit down and see what all the fuss is about with Iron Giant. So we rented it and watched it. Obviously, no Brad Bird, writer-director, his work from Pixar and all the stuff he's been doing since then. But it's a great movie. It's a great kids movie, has a lot of good themes about nature versus nurture, and can you choose to be something other than what you are? And then of course the Easter themes of sacrificing oneself, laying down one's life for not only one's friends but one's enemies, and then resurrection. So
yeah, it's interesting when you talk about it in the context of 1999, because you had Fight Club, The Matrix, The Sixth Sense, Blair Witch Project. We could go on and on. And I was trying to remember, so I have top 10 lists going back to 1998, and it's not on mine, to my shame. And I'm trying to figure out, I wasn't working, I don't think at that point I was working as a full-time movie critic yet, but I was certainly doing freelance work, and it must have slipped by me as well. I almost wonder if I had seen it or if I had to catch up with it later because of a smaller release, as you said. I don't remember if it got that wide of a release or what it might have been, or if I was just awash in all those other titles. But it is one that I eventually, did see and came to appreciate and love revisiting. For me, it does come back to a lot of that animation style, the nostalgia of it, but just the artistry in it and the character animation in particular. You said he's big, but this robot is like, we're talking Godzilla size, right? And yet somehow the movie manages to combine that intimidation factor with giving this robot a lot of personality. From Crash Landing on Earth, his jaw is a little crooked, which sometimes makes him look like he's smiling. There's the dent in his helmet, which makes him seem a little vulnerable. So he has those elements, but he's also very cool in a robot-y way that, any kid who's into like sci-fi stuff would just love sort of the Art Deco flair from even earlier Atomic Age illustrations and posters we're familiar with. So it has that. And then also Vin Diesel as the voice. He doesn't get a lot of lines, but I think he kind of brings that same combination, the burliness, but also a personal approachability. So I just love the animation that's at work in this movie.
Oh, it makes me wonder, you mentioning that, Vin Diesel, voice of Groot also, which is a similar, like, he gets 3 words and has to do so much. It makes me wonder if we get lost in the fast and furiousness of Vin Diesel and don't appreciate a lot of the heavy lifting he's doing with honestly fairly thankless voice acting roles. Like, it is hard to do what he manages to do with both of those roles, and it's nice. Literally am just thinking about that right now.
Yeah, no, it's nice to have that balance to the, kind of the caricature of Vin Diesel we get in some of his other stuff. That's for sure. So in your very impressive breakdown, I mean, you took us quickly through pretty much the Iron Giant there, JR, which is fine. We're all spoilers on this episode. We have to be, given the context we want to talk about. But you already kind of touched on the resurrection and the Easter implications here, right? And they do start with that Superman connotation, which the movie makes very literal, as you said. You might get a sense of it as a viewer just from the opening when we see this being land from outer space onto Earth and being somewhat confused. But yeah, there's a Superman comic book referenced, and even the robot himself, he finds in this junkyard something that has an S on it. And after he's been introduced to the comic, he kind of finds a way to attach it to his chest. And I think in that moment when he collides with the missile, doesn't he even say Superman?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's all over there. And of course, Superman is often considered to be like one of the pop culture Christ figures, at least as he's been, accepted and carried on in the years and interpreted by various audiences. Is there anything else? Maybe that overarching theme is there. Are there any other details that struck you in terms of Iron Giant being an Easter film or a resurrection film?
I think we need to make more about the fact that it's after the turn, right? We don't have a moment of Jesus giving into his human nature. The closest we might get to that is the Garden of Gethsemane, where he asks, like, can we please activate a plan B or a plan C? Like, is there any other way to do this? But if not, I'll do it, right? That's probably the closest we get to Jesus not following God's will. Even in that space, he's honest and he's full of, I would be suspicious of anyone who like gleefully skips towards the cross, right? So it's not surprising that he doesn't want to die. So it's not that he sins there. It's just that he experiences the full weight of his human finiteness, his finitude there. The Iron Giant, though, does have this space where he like gives over to his what we would call like, I don't know, drone defensive programming and goes full like murder
programming,
bot, right?
I think works.
So that's a difference. But then once we're on the other side of that, when the robot realizes that, Hogarth is okay, and now there's this missile that's coming, there is a way to write this story where he takes the boy and leaves and they're just okay, or where he reorients the missile at the military people and destroys, allows them to be destroyed by the consequences of their own choice. I mean, there's several different ways to do this, but what we get is him dying for, in the language of the film, the world, right? He dies for basically all of the characters that we have met in the film, right? So yeah, the whole world is not in danger, but the world of everyone that we know, good and bad and in between. And so I think that's really important, because a lot of what we see in the Easter story are these people who are against Jesus, the Judean, the citizens of Jerusalem who are calling for his death, the religious leaders who are conspiring and manipulating their own laws to do this, the Romans who are just looking for an easy way to, keep peace and all of that. Like all of these people, from the actively evil to the passively evil to the people who just stand back and let things happen, are included in Jesus's forgiveness and in his resurrection. And I think sometimes we miss that in our evangelical way of talking about Jesus dying for our sins at Easter.
It's a thought of more in personal terms, is what you're saying.
Yeah, which is great, right? Like I love it when people understand that God loves them and cares for, but when we then extend that to specifically our enemies, that God also loves them, and that in a way, one thing I've said before is, Jesus dies for us so that we can die then with Jesus, right? Jesus invites us to pick up our own crosses and follow him. And I love that you started the whole episode by saying it's weird for us to be thinking about the empty tomb before the cross, because that's the order of things in Scripture, right? Like, we want to skip sometimes to the resurrection story and to the good and to the flourishing without having to pick up our own crosses and follow Jesus. And so I think that's one of the reasons the Iron Giant has only gained in popularity, because it's significantly more profound than even a lot of the Christ allegories that we get.
Yeah. And I think that is a startling development when you do see that is going to be the robot's choice, not to be the more action heroic decision, which might be some of those other options you talk about, and certainly including the military and the lead government agent, who has at this point, he's really, I think, kidnapped or at least been on the verge of abusing this kid and trying to get the information. I mean, there's a villain, like a straight up villain in that government agent. And even he, as you said, is kind of included in this act of saving grace. And that scene you mentioned earlier, the resurrection scene, there's something really interesting about it. It does come, I forget if it's like a few months later, we get this sort of, after the robot has met the missile, we get a couple of months. It might be years, but it's down the line. And Hogarth is given from one of the military leaders this screw that is part of the robot that they uncovered. And what happens, and we've seen this earlier in the film, that if the robot is damaged, it can activate the damaged part to reattach itself, right? So this screw begins moving, and it ends up kind of rolling out of Hogarth's window. And I love how Hogarth seems to know what's happening. I forget if he says goodbye or something like that. And then we follow this screw traveling, it looks like, almost to the North Pole. And as we go, we see another part of the Iron Giant and another part, and they each start to get activating and going towards eventually where we see his head is kind of sending out that signal. And it struck me that there's one very interesting connection there. It's the bodily nature of the resurrection. Like, we see all of these body parts coming together. And that's very evocative of the way the resurrection of the body is part of Christ's story, right? And it's part of the promise for us. So it's not only that, that's what the Easter story gives us. It's not only that Christ has risen and then floats away, but there's this time in the gospel, right, where in bodily form, he is spending time with others and visiting them and really continuing the ministry that he had started beforehand, but it is in this bodily form. So I just like that touch in the movie. I mean, again, to your point of like, how could you have done this? So many ways they could have depicted the robot coming back. That itself is maybe like not the biggest surprise, especially in a family movie. but a really interesting choice to kind of do it in this very bodily way.
Yeah, and that it's funny because as we were talking, and I had another thought that connects to that so thoroughly, because it begs the question, not in a way that says we want to see an Iron Giant 2, though the movie's great and we love to spend more time in the world, but we don't need to see what happens next. I think the film is complete and the story is complete. But when the giant first appears from the heavens, he is a figure who inspires in most of, again, I'm going to use the world here in the terms we were earlier, like the world of the people we meet in the film, inspires fear.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that this is because it's against a backdrop of the Cold War and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
But, we get in that little flash forward before the screw makes its little journey, we get, a statue of the robot, and we see that his presence has now become a symbol of hope. And again, I think about that when we talk about incarnation. This is that, right? If you go back to a lot of ancient mythology, it was always a mixed bag when the gods came to the earth. You never knew for sure whether they were there just to fulfill their own carnal pleasures, or whether they were there to play tricks, or whether they might be there to help you. Like that happens sometimes too. But it was their arrival was at best a source of ambivalence and oftentimes fear. And I think what we see with Jesus is this, what we said, if we can go back to the other holiday, Christmas, right? It's Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us, and that's good news. And that we see that all the way through the cross. To your point, it's not just that Jesus's death created a world where we could live free of fear. It's that then he is raised bodily to inhabit that world with us. And so it's kind of fun for me, riffing off of what you said about the robot's bodily resurrection, to imagine when the robot goes back and visits Hogarth, and now we have the robot living in this world bodily with his new family, we could say, in a world where they're not afraid of him anymore.
Yeah.
And again, I just see so many echoes of that, where the author of Hebrews talks about how when God descended onto the mountaintop, everyone was terrified. And he says, and yet we have God in Christ who lives with us. It's simultaneously, how much more terrifying should it be to have God where we can reach out and touch him, and yet also what we have instead of fear is this peace and this love. So I don't know, that I hadn't thought about that before we started recording, but when you talked about the robot's bodily resurrection, that's kind of where I went.
Yeah, and I like that idea of the giant returning to be embraced the way that Hogarth immediately embraced him, but everyone else was either the opposite or had to come around a little bit. That said, I think the movie, I agree with you, ends perfectly. I'm glad we don't see him, completely coming together and flying off for this hug or whatever with Hogarth. I think it ends on a really, really lovely note and leaves that to our imagination. So that's one of its strengths as well, for sure. Well, thanks, JR. I feel like it's been a long time since we talked. I forget which episode you were on last, but this is good to have you back. Anything you've been up to that TC listeners might want to check out, other podcasts or other things you've been writing?
My Fascinating podcast that I co-host regularly just did our March Madness episode, where we take a bunch of pop culture, so it's film, TV, memes, current events, and we just completely arbitrarily pit them against each other and argue about them until we get to a final game. So it always proves to be one of our most popular episodes of the year.
Oh, yeah?
And so we just released that. It'll be a couple weeks ago now when this episode airs. So yeah, surely TC listeners would enjoy that.
Yeah, it sounds fun. Are you at a point where you can say certain memes or certain characters that are looking to have a good run, or?
So I'll say this, I feel comfortable saying this by the time it comes out. The final game was between Chloe Zhao winning the first woman of color to win Best Director and Squid Game.
So, okay. So now let me wrap my mind around this. So that's basically that idea, Chloe Zhao winning, is up against that series, and you have to choose which you value more.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I thought the film spotting madness we do on the film spotting podcast, pitting movies against each other, was kind of crazy, but this is really bending my brain.
Yeah, it's even more arbitrary. That's the whole thing, right? Like when we give our reasons, it's like, okay, I mean, whatever. Sure. I can't argue. With film spotting, I feel like, yeah, you guys know what you're talking about. And there are criteria by which we judge movies. And so there's a case to be made. Ours is just madness in its purest sense.
It sounds like it. Well, I'm going to vote for Chloe Zhao just because I didn't watch Squid Game, so that's an easy answer for me. And yeah,
I
would encourage...
also chose her because
Okay.
I really liked Eternals a lot more than most people did, apparently.
So you're one of those. You're one of those
I was one of
Eternals
those.
defenders. Okay.
I wouldn't say I'm a defender. I would just say I personally enjoyed it a lot, and I liked it even better the second time I watched it.
Fair enough. It had its good qualities. I'll give you that. And Zhao is definitely an incredible filmmaker. All right, so that's the Fascinating Podcast. When listeners are done hearing this, they can head over there. Thanks again, JR. This was fun.
Always a pleasure, Josh. Thank you.
Thanks to John J. Thompson for providing a secular soundtrack to Holy Week with the Spotify playlist that he compiled for this episode. You missed hearing a few selections of his if you're watching this on YouTube. But if you search for the Think Christian playlist on Spotify, you can hear the Smiths, Solange, and a bunch of other songs that speak to Holy Week in some way. Thanks to John J. Thompson, Abby, and JR for joining me on this show. You can follow all of them on Twitter at John J. Thompson, at JR Forasteros, and at Abby Olchesi. They make it easy for you. We, of course, are on Twitter and Facebook as well at Think Christian. The TC Podcast is a listener-supported program of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more info. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy is Robin Bassett. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to consider how another aspect of our pop culture fandom connects with our faith.